There comes a moment in your life when you realize that the thing you have been praying would change may not be the thing that needs to change. Maybe you have spent months or years hoping for accountability. Maybe you kept waiting for the apology that never came, the empathy that arrived, arrived, the consistency that always seemed just out of reach. Maybe you kept thinking, if I explain it one more time, they will finally understand. If I love them differently, they will treat me differently. If I become more patient, more forgiving, more understanding, perhaps this relationship will finally become what I always believed it could be. And then something begins to happen inside you. Not necessarily something dramatic, not necessarily a lightning bolt. Sometimes it is quieter than that. Sometimes it is the moment you stop arguing with reality. Sometimes it is the morning you wake up and realize you are tired of explaining your pain to someone who keeps creating it. Sometimes it is the evening when you look at your phone and realize you no longer want the message you once desperately waited for. Sometimes it is the moment you hear the familiar criticism, manipulation, accusation, or emotional withdrawal, and instead of immediately defending yourself, something inside you says, I understand the pattern now. People often describe these moments as signs from the universe. And whether you understand that spiritually, psychologically, metaphorically, or simply as the natural process of awakening to reality, there is something deeply meaningful about them. Because sometimes the greatest change in your life does not begin when another person leaves. It begins when you stop abandoning yourself to keep them. That is what we are going to talk about today. 3 powerful signs can appear before you finally separate yourself from a destructive relationship. These signs are not supernatural guarantees. They are not proof that some cosmic force has selected a person to disappear from your life. They are better understood as moments of psychological clarity. Moments when your mind, emotions, values, and boundaries begin moving in a new direction. And if you have been dealing with narcissistic behavior, manipulation, emotional invalidation, gaslighting, blame shifting, or a relationship where you constantly feel responsible for another person's emotions, these signs can be especially important because the narcissistic dynamic can be confusing. You may not simply be dealing with someone who is difficult. You may be dealing with a pattern where your reality is repeatedly questioned. Your feelings are minimized. Your boundaries are challenged. And accountability somehow always travels in one direction, toward you. You apologize. They explain why you deserved it. You express hurt. They tell you that you are too sensitive. You ask for accountability. They tell you that you are attacking them. You establish a boundary. They accuse you of being selfish. You become exhausted. They call you difficult. And eventually, you begin questioning yourself. That is one of the most damaging parts of chronic emotional manipulation. It does not merely hurt your feelings. Over time, it can interfere with your confidence in your own perception. You start wondering, am I really the problem? You replay conversations. You analyze text messages. You examine your tone. You wonder whether you were too emotional. You wonder whether you should have been more patient. You wonder whether you expected too much. You begin conducting an internal investigation into yourself while barely investigating the behavior happening around you. And this is where the first sign becomes so important. The first sign is that you begin seeing the pattern instead of isolated incidents. That sounds simple, but psychologically, it can be enormous. When someone behaves badly once, you may interpret it as a mistake. When they behave badly repeatedly, you may still interpret each incident separately because hope encourages us to compartmentalize. You say, "That was just a bad day." Then it happens again. That was because they were stressed. Again, they are dealing with their own wounds. Again, they had a difficult childhood. Again, they really do love me underneath all of this. Again. And eventually, the individual incidents begin forming a pattern: the criticism, the withdrawal, the sudden affection, the blame, the apology without meaningful change, the promises, the repetition, the confusion, the reconciliation, the same injury. The cycle becomes the relationship. And once you see the cycle, it becomes much harder to convince yourself that each event is unrelated. This is why awareness can feel like a spiritual awakening, even when there is a psychological explanation for it. Your brain is integrating information that you previously kept separate. You are no longer saying, "This happened." You are saying, "This keeps happening." That sentence can change your life because "this happened" invites you to forgive another isolated event. "This keeps happening" invites you to examine the entire relationship. And that is where clarity begins. Maybe you remember the first time you felt deeply confused by this person. You remember how intensely they seemed to care. Maybe there was an early period when you felt chosen, understood, admired, or emotionally connected. Then gradually things changed. Perhaps affection became conditional. Perhaps admiration became criticism. Perhaps curiosity about you became control over you. Perhaps communication became interrogation. Perhaps love became something you had to earn. This is one reason relationships involving narcissistic patterns can be so difficult to leave. You are not only leaving what the relationship is, you may also be grieving what you believed it could become. You may be attached to the potential. You may be attached to the early version of the relationship. You may be attached to the moments of warmth that appeared between periods of emotional pain. And intermittent reinforcement can make this especially powerful. When positive attention arrives unpredictably after periods of rejection or distress, the brain may become intensely focused on obtaining the next moment of connection. That can create a cycle where the relationship hurts you, then temporarily comforts you from the pain it created. And because relief can feel like love when you have been deprived of emotional safety, you may mistake the reduction of pain for genuine intimacy. Think about that. If someone repeatedly creates emotional distress and then gives you affection, you may experience enormous relief. But relief is not necessarily security. You deserve security. You deserve consistency. You deserve relationships where peace does not depend on predicting another person's mood. You deserve to express disappointment without fearing retaliation. You deserve to say no without being punished. You deserve to have a different opinion without being treated as disloyal. You deserve to exist without constantly managing someone else's emotional state. And when you begin recognizing that, something inside you changes. That is the first sign. The second sign is emotional exhaustion, not ordinary tiredness. A deeper exhaustion, the kind where you realize you are spending enormous psychological energy trying to maintain something that continually destabilizes you. You become tired of explaining, tired of defending, tired of proving, tired of waiting, tired of anticipating, tired of wondering what version of the person will show up today, tired of rehearsing conversations before having them, tired of rewriting messages so they cannot be misunderstood, tired of apologizing for things you did not do, tired of being punished for having needs. And sometimes exhaustion is the body's way of telling you that the strategy you have been using is no longer sustainable. For a long time, you may have survived through adaptation. You learned what subjects to avoid. You learned when to speak. You learned when to remain silent. You learned how to read facial expressions. You learned how to recognize changes in tone. You learned how to calm the other person. You learned how to apologize quickly. You learned how to make yourself smaller. You learned how to become emotionally invisible when necessary. And you may have called that love. But sometimes what we call love is actually hypervigilance. Sometimes what we call patience is actually self-abandonment. Sometimes what we call understanding is actually making endless excuses for behavior that continues to harm us. And I want you to hear this without judgment. You adapted because you were trying to survive the relationship you were in. That does not make you weak. It means you were attempting to create safety with the tools you had. But eventually, survival strategies can become exhausting. You cannot spend your entire life regulating another adult. You cannot make another person accountable. You cannot love another person into emotional maturity. You cannot communicate perfectly enough to prevent someone committed to misunderstanding you from misunderstanding you. You cannot be kind enough to make someone incapable of respecting boundaries suddenly respect them. And you cannot sacrifice yourself indefinitely and call that healing. At some point, your exhaustion may become information. Your exhaustion may be telling you something has to change. And sometimes that change is not the other person. Sometimes it is you. Not because you caused the problem, but because you are finally recognizing that you have control over your participation in the cycle. This is where the third sign appears. You begin to lose the desire to convince them. This may be one of the most profound psychological shifts you will ever experience. For a long time, you may have believed that closure would come when they finally understood. You imagined the perfect conversation. You imagined explaining everything calmly. You imagined showing them the evidence. You imagined them finally looking at you and saying, "You were right. I hurt you. I understand now." And perhaps that happens sometimes. But healing cannot depend on another person's ability or willingness to validate your reality. Because if your peace requires their agreement, they still have power over your peace. Ride that again. If you need the person who hurt you to confirm that they hurt you before you are allowed to heal, you are still waiting for permission. You do not need permission. You do not need a confession. You do not need a perfect explanation. You do not need them to agree with your boundary. Your boundary becomes real because you choose it. And this is where no contact, when appropriate and safe, can become powerful. No contact is not revenge. No contact is not a performance. No contact is not about making someone suffer. No contact is not secretly checking whether they are suffering. No contact is about reducing access to a cycle that repeatedly destabilizes you. And if complete no contact is impossible because of children, work, family responsibilities, finances, or other circumstances, structured low contact or limited communication may be more realistic. The principle remains the same. Reduce unnecessary emotional access. Stop explaining yourself endlessly. Stop responding to every provocation. Stop treating every accusation as a problem you must solve. Stop allowing someone else's emotional storm to become your emergency. Because manipulation often depends upon engagement. A provocative statement may be designed, consciously or unconsciously, to pull you into defending yourself. You defend, they counter. You explain, they reinterpret. You provide evidence, they attack your motives. You become emotional. They point to your emotional reaction as proof that you are the problem. And suddenly, the original issue has disappeared. That is how circular conflict can work. You entered the conversation asking for accountability. You leave the conversation apologizing. You entered saying, "That behavior hurt me." You leave saying, "I'm sorry I reacted." You entered asking for respect. You leave questioning whether you were too demanding. This is why boundaries are so important. A boundary is not an attempt to control another person. A boundary is a decision about what you will do. You cannot say, "You are not allowed to criticize me." You can say, "If the conversation becomes insulting, I will end the conversation." You cannot force someone to respect your time. You can stop making yourself endlessly available. You cannot force someone to communicate honestly. You can choose not to participate in conversations built on deception and manipulation. You cannot force someone to become accountable. You can stop rescuing them from the consequences of their behavior. That is empowerment. And empowerment is not becoming cold. It is becoming clear. There is a difference. Coldness says, "I do not care about anyone." Clarity says, I care about myself too. Coldness says, I will never trust anyone again. Clarity says, I will trust slowly and pay attention to patterns. Coldness says, nobody gets access to me. Clarity says, access to me is earned through consistency, respect, honesty, and reciprocity. That is healing. And perhaps you have been waiting for the universe to remove the narcissistic person from your life. But maybe the deeper transformation is that the universe does not have to remove them before you begin removing their psychological influence from you. Maybe the first removal happens inside. You remove their voice from your internal dialogue. You stop asking, what would they think? You stop measuring your decisions against their approval. You stop hearing their criticism every time you look at yourself. You stop using their standards to measure your worth. You stop trying to prove that you are lovable to someone who made love feel like a test. That is freedom. And freedom can begin before circumstances change. Let me tell you something important. You may never receive the apology you deserve. You may never receive the explanation you wanted. You may never see the person become the version of themselves you hoped they would become. And that is painful. We should not pretend it is not. There is grief in accepting that someone you loved may not be capable of giving you the relationship you hoped for. There is grief in realizing that potential is not the same thing as reality. There is grief in recognizing that a person's difficult past may explain some of their behavior without excusing the harm they cause. Compassion does not require access. Understanding does not require tolerance of mistreatment. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do and still decide that you cannot live with the consequences of that behavior. That is emotional maturity. You can say, I understand that you were hurt, and also say, you cannot hurt me. You can say, I understand your fear, and also say, your fear does not justify controlling me. You can say, I understand your insecurity, and also say, your insecurity does not give you permission to destroy my confidence. This is where your healing becomes deeper than simply getting away. Because leaving physically is one thing. Leaving psychologically is another. You can leave someone and still spend years mentally arguing with them. You can block a number and still carry the person in your head. You can move to another city and still hear their criticism inside your mind. You can start another relationship and still wonder whether you are too needy. You can achieve extraordinary things and still secretly believe that you have to earn your worth. So the goal is not simply distance. The goal is internal freedom, and internal freedom takes time. You may have to grieve. You may have to journal. You may have to rebuild friendships. You may have to rediscover interests you abandoned. You may have to learn to tolerate silence because chaos once felt normal. You may have to learn that peace can feel uncomfortable when your nervous system has become accustomed to unpredictability. This is something people do not always understand about healing. When you have spent a long time in emotional instability, calm can initially feel strange. You may mistake peace for boredom. You may mistake consistency for lack of chemistry. You may feel uncomfortable when someone communicates directly because you are accustomed to decoding hidden meanings. You may become suspicious when someone treats you well because your previous experiences taught you to expect a hidden cost. This does not mean you are broken. It means your emotional system may need time to recalibrate. Healing is not simply learning what to avoid. It is learning what safety feels like. Safety may feel boring at first because there is nothing to solve. There is no crisis, no silent treatment, no guessing, no emotional roller coaster, no dramatic reconciliation, no need to prove your loyalty, just consistency. And consistency can feel unfamiliar when chaos has been normalized. So give yourself time. Do not shame yourself for still missing someone. Missing someone does not mean you made the wrong decision. It means you formed an attachment. It means you are human. You can miss someone and still know they are unhealthy for you. You can love someone and still leave. You can forgive someone and still maintain distance. You can wish them well and still refuse to reopen the door. These things can coexist. Healing is not about turning love into hatred. Healing is about turning attachment into wisdom. And this brings us back to the idea of signs. Maybe the first sign is that the pattern becomes visible. Maybe the second is that the exhaustion becomes undeniable. Maybe the third is that you stop trying to convince the person and begin protecting yourself. Those are powerful turning points. And if you are currently experiencing one of them, do not rush to judge yourself. Maybe you are not becoming heartless. Maybe you are becoming honest. Maybe you are not losing your ability to love. Maybe you are learning that love without boundaries can become self-abandonment. Maybe you are not becoming selfish. Maybe you are finally including yourself in the equation. Think about how often you were taught to consider everyone else's feelings. Did you consider theirs before yours? Did you ask what they needed? Did you worry about upsetting them? Did you modify your behavior to keep them comfortable? Did you apologize even when you were hurt? Did you suppress your anger because you feared what would happen if you expressed it? Now ask yourself something different. What do I need? What makes me feel safe? What behavior will I no longer accept? What does respect look like to me? What would my life look like if I stopped organizing it around someone else's emotional volatility? These questions can feel uncomfortable, but they are liberating because narcissistic dynamics can teach you to become externally focused. You become an expert in them. Their mood, their reaction, their opinion, their needs, their image, their approval, their anger, their silence, their disappointment. And meanwhile, you disappear. Healing reverses that direction. You begin becoming an expert in yourself. What do you value? What are your limits? What are your needs? What are your dreams? What kind of relationships do you want? What kind of person do you want to become? And perhaps most importantly, what are you no longer willing to betray within yourself just to keep someone else close? That last question can change everything. Because self-respect is not built by repeating affirmations while continuing to violate your own boundaries. Self-respect is built through action. Every time you keep a boundary, you teach yourself that your word matters. Every time you walk away from disrespect, you teach yourself that your dignity matters. Every time you refuse to engage in a manipulative argument, you teach yourself that your peace matters. Every time you choose reality over fantasy, you teach yourself that truth matters. And slowly, your identity begins returning. The person you were before the relationship may not come back exactly as they were, and that is okay. You may become wiser, more discerning, more compassionate toward yourself, more careful with access, more comfortable saying no, more willing to leave situations that require you to betray your values. That is not the destruction of your old self. That is the development of a stronger one. Now, there is something else we need to talk about. Sometimes when people finally begin withdrawing from a narcissistic dynamic, the other person may intensify their efforts to regain attention. This can include sudden affection, promises, guilt, accusations, dramatic apologies, nostalgia, or attempts to make you believe that leaving proves you never cared. Not every person with narcissistic traits will behave this way, and not every attempt to reconnect is necessarily malicious. But in unhealthy relationship patterns, renewed attention can sometimes function as a way of restoring the previous dynamic rather than creating genuine change. That distinction matters. Words are information. Behavior is stronger information. Promises are information. Consistency is stronger information. An apology is information. Sustained accountability is stronger information. Do not evaluate transformation by the intensity of one emotional conversation. Look at patterns over time. Does the person take responsibility without adding a but? Do they respect your boundaries even when they dislike them? Do they stop blaming you for their behavior? Do they seek appropriate help when needed? Do they tolerate your independence? Do they accept that you can disagree with them? Do they demonstrate change consistently rather than only when they fear losing access? These questions can help you move from emotional hope to observable reality. And remember, you are not responsible for diagnosing anyone. You do not need to prove that someone is a narcissist before deciding that their behavior is unhealthy for you. That is another important lesson. Sometimes people get trapped asking, are they really a narcissist? But the more useful question may be, how does this relationship affect me? You do not need a clinical label to justify protecting yourself from manipulation, contempt, intimidation, chronic dishonesty, emotional abuse, or repeated boundary violations. Your experience matters. Your safety matters. Your dignity matters. And if you are in a situation where leaving could create physical danger, financial danger, housing instability, or other serious risks, do not treat no contact as a simplistic instruction. Safety planning and professional support may be necessary. Boundaries should protect you, not put you at greater risk. That is what responsible healing looks like. It is not about dramatic gestures. It is about wise decisions. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is quietly stop participating. No announcement, no revenge, no social media performance. No attempt to make them jealous. No campaign to prove that you were right. Just distance. Just consistency. Just rebuilding. Because the moment you stop making your healing a message for someone else is the moment your healing becomes yours. You do not have to become successful to make them regret losing you. You do not have to become beautiful to make them jealous. You do not have to find another partner to prove you are desirable. You do not have to create a perfect life so someone else realizes what they lost. Build your life because you want to live it. That is the difference between revenge and recovery. Revenge keeps the other person at the center. Recovery puts you back at the center of your own life. And that is where your power returns. Maybe one day you will realize that you no longer check whether they have contacted you. Maybe one day you will hear their name and feel nothing more than recognition. Maybe one day you will remember the relationship and realize you no longer want to rewrite the ending. Maybe you will finally say, "It happened. It hurt me. I learned from it. And now I am moving forward." That is closure, not because they gave it to you, because you created it. Closure is sometimes accepting that you will never receive the perfect ending from the person who created the painful chapter. You close the chapter yourself. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning behind the phrase, "The universe removes a narcissist from your life." Maybe the universe does not always remove people by force. Maybe sometimes you become strong enough to stop opening the door. Maybe the sign is not that they disappear. Maybe the sign is that their presence no longer controls your identity. Maybe the sign is that you finally believe yourself. You no longer need someone else to tell you whether what happened was real. You know what you experienced. You know what you tolerated. You know what you learned. And you know what you will choose differently now. That is awakening. And if you are in that place today, I want you to stop blaming yourself for how long it took. You were not stupid. You were attached. You were hopeful. You were trying. You were trying to make sense of something that did not make sense. You were trying to preserve a relationship you believed was valuable. You were trying to love someone. And sometimes loving someone teaches you exactly where you must draw the line. Do not punish yourself for having a compassionate heart. Instead, teach your compassionate heart boundaries. You do not need to become less loving. You need to become more discerning about where your love goes. You do not need to stop believing in people. You need to believe in patterns more than promises. You do not need to stop giving. You need to stop giving at the expense of yourself. You do not need to become suspicious of everyone. You need to become attentive to consistency. You do not need to become emotionally unavailable. You need to become emotionally responsible for yourself. And this is where your next chapter begins. Not with hatred, not with revenge, not with proving, with peace. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that you no longer feel responsible for someone else's mood. Imagine making a decision without hearing their criticism in your head. Imagine saying no without writing a 5-paragraph explanation. Imagine taking a break without fearing punishment. Imagine receiving kindness without wondering what it will cost you. Imagine having a disagreement without fearing abandonment. Imagine being loved without having to audition for it. That life is possible. But you must be willing to stop negotiating with the behaviors that keep you from it. You must be willing to let some people misunderstand you. This is difficult, especially if you spent years trying to be understood. But sometimes your freedom begins when you accept that someone may misunderstand your boundary and you no longer feel compelled to correct their interpretation. They may call you selfish. You know why you said no. They may call you cold. You know why you needed distance. They may call you difficult. You know what you were no longer willing to tolerate. They may tell others a different version of the story. You do not have to chase every version. Truth does not become false because someone tells a different story. Your healing does not require unanimous approval. And that is a powerful lesson for anyone recovering from emotional manipulation. You can survive being misunderstood. You can survive someone's disappointment. You can survive someone's anger. You can survive someone's decision to portray you negatively. What becomes much harder is surviving years of betraying yourself to prevent someone else from being unhappy. So choose yourself, not selfishly, not cruelly, responsibly. Choose yourself with compassion. Choose yourself with wisdom. Choose yourself with boundaries. Choose yourself with patience. And when you feel guilty for doing it, remember that guilt is not always evidence that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt appears because you are doing something unfamiliar. If you spent years prioritizing someone else, prioritizing yourself may initially feel selfish. If you spent years saying yes, saying no may feel cruel. If you spent years explaining, silence may feel wrong. If you spent years chasing reconciliation, walking away may feel terrifying. But unfamiliar does not mean unhealthy. Sometimes unfamiliar is simply what growth feels like. So let yourself grow. Let yourself disappoint people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Let yourself become less available to manipulation. Let yourself become less interested in proving your worth. Let yourself become more interested in living according to your values. Your life does not need to remain a courtroom where you constantly defend your character. You are allowed to leave the courtroom. You are allowed to stop presenting evidence. You are allowed to stop arguing with someone who has already decided what they want to believe. You are allowed to redirect your energy toward people who are capable of mutual respect. And slowly, something beautiful happens. You begin trusting yourself again. You begin noticing your intuition. You begin recognizing discomfort earlier. You begin seeing red flags before they become emergencies. You begin believing actions. You begin listening when your body says something feels wrong. You begin honoring your own limits. And that is one of the greatest gifts that can come from healing, not becoming someone who never gets hurt again. Becoming someone who knows what to do when something hurts. You cannot control every person you meet. You cannot guarantee that nobody will manipulate you. You cannot prevent every disappointment. But you can become more difficult to manipulate because you know yourself. You know your values. You know your boundaries. You know your non-negotiables. You know what healthy reciprocity looks like. And you know that loneliness is not worse than losing yourself. That is a profound realization. Because one of the greatest fears that keeps people in unhealthy relationships is the fear of being alone. But loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Loneliness is the pain of feeling disconnected. Solitude can be the space where you reconnect with yourself. And sometimes being alone for a season is healthier than being accompanied by someone who makes you feel alone every day. You may have to rebuild. Do it. You may have to start over. Start. You may have to grieve. Grieve, you may have to learn who you are again. Learn. There is no shame in rebuilding your life. There is courage in it. And perhaps one day you will look back and understand that the relationship you thought was destroying your life became the place where you discovered your boundaries. The place where you discovered your voice. The place where you learned to recognize manipulation. The place where you learned that love without respect is not enough. The place where you learned that empathy without boundaries can become self-neglect. The place where you learned that forgiveness does not require continued access. The place where you learned that walking away can sometimes be an act of profound self-respect. You do not have to be grateful for the harm, but you can be grateful for the wisdom you built afterward. And there is a difference. Do not romanticize what happened. Do not tell yourself that abuse was necessary. Do not tell yourself that suffering was the only way you could become strong. You deserved kindness before the pain. You deserved respect before the lesson. But now that you have survived it, you can choose what you carry forward. Carry the wisdom. Leave the shame. Carry the boundaries. Leave the self-blame. Carry the clarity. Leave the confusion. Carry the compassion. Leave the self-abandonment. Carry the lessons. Leave the cycle. And if you are standing at the edge of a new chapter right now, remember these 3 signs. You are beginning to see the pattern. You are beginning to feel the exhaustion. And you are beginning to stop convincing them while starting to protect yourself. Those are not signs that you are becoming heartless. They may be signs that you are becoming whole, The person you have been waiting for may not come back. The apology may not arrive. The explanation may never satisfy you. But you are coming back. You are returning to yourself. And that may be the most important return of your life. So stop asking, when will they finally understand my worth? Ask, when will I stop requiring them to understand it before I believe it? Stop asking, will they regret losing me? Ask, will I regret losing myself again? Stop asking, will they change? Ask, what choices am I willing to change? Stop asking, how can I make them treat me better? Ask, what will I do when someone repeatedly treats me poorly? Those questions move you from helplessness to agency. And agency is where healing begins. Your worth was never created by their admiration. Your worth was never destroyed by their criticism. Their inability to appreciate you does not make you less valuable. Their rejection does not define you. Their anger does not define you. Their accusations do not define you. Their version of you does not define you. You get to define who you become from this point forward. And maybe the universe did not send you a message written in the sky. Maybe it sent you something much quieter. Awareness, exhaustion, clarity, a boundary, a moment of courage, a growing refusal to betray yourself. Maybe the sign was the day you finally heard your own voice again. And when you hear that voice, listen, because it may be saying, enough. Not enough because you hate them. Enough because you love yourself. Enough because your nervous system deserves peace. Enough because your future deserves your energy. Enough because your children, your friendships, your work, your dreams, and your health deserve a version of you that is not constantly consumed by someone else's chaos. Enough because your life is too valuable to spend endlessly trying to convince another person to recognize what should never have required convincing. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to stay away. You are allowed to rebuild. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to become someone who no longer confuses emotional intensity with intimacy. You are allowed to discover that peace is not boring. Peace is precious. You are allowed to discover that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with handles you control. You decide who enters. You decide how long they stay. You decide what behavior is acceptable. And you decide when the door needs to close. Not because you are cruel, because your life matters. So, if someone is being removed from your life right now, do not immediately ask what you are losing. Ask what space is being created. Space for peace, space for clarity, space for friendships that feel reciprocal, space for love that does not require fear, space for dreams you postponed. Space for a version of yourself you stopped recognizing, space to breathe, space to heal, space to become. And if the person returns, remember, you do not have to reopen the door simply because someone knocks. A knock is not transformation. A promise is not transformation. An emotional speech is not transformation. Change is demonstrated over time through accountability, consistency, respect, and behavior. And even if someone genuinely changes, you still have the right to decide whether reconnecting is healthy for you. You are not obligated to give access simply because someone asks. Your boundary is yours. Your life is yours. Your future is yours. And perhaps this is the real message you needed today. The universe does not have to prove to you that someone is bad before you are allowed to protect yourself. You do not need a cosmic announcement. You do not need a perfect sign. You need honesty. You need awareness. You need courage. And you need permission from yourself. So give yourself that permission now. Baffincher to stop chasing. Baffincher to stop explaining. Permission to stop proving. Prevention to stop waiting for someone else's validation. Prevention to grieve. Prevention to heal slowly. Prevention to rebuild. Permission to say no. Prevention to walk away. Prevention to choose peace. And most importantly, permission to believe yourself. Because there may come a day when you realize that the greatest person you lost was not the narcissistic person who walked out of your life. It was the version of you who disappeared while trying to keep them happy. And the greatest recovery may not be getting that person back. It may be getting yourself back. So take yourself back. Take back your mornings. Take back your evenings. Take back your attention. Take back your dreams. Take back your voice. Take back your boundaries. Take back your confidence. Take back your right to say no. Take back your right to have needs. Take back your right to disagree. Take back your right to live without constantly defending your existence. And when you do not look backward waiting for them to notice. Look forward, because your future does not need their permission. Your healing does not need their participation. Your peace does not need their approval. Your life does not need their understanding. You can move forward without them understanding. You can heal without them apologizing. You can grow without them witnessing it. You can become whole without them ever recognizing what they lost. And that is freedom. Not the freedom to make them suffer. The freedom to stop organizing your life around whether they suffer. Not the freedom to win, the freedom to stop playing. Not the freedom to prove that you were right, the freedom to stop needing to be proven right. And when you finally reach that place, something inside you becomes quiet. The questions become quieter. The obsession becomes quieter. The need for answers becomes quieter. The emotional pull becomes quieter. And in that quiet, you finally hear something you may not have heard in a very long time, your own voice. And your own voice says, I am still here. I survived. I learned. I am worthy. I am allowed to have peace. I am allowed to choose myself. I am allowed to build a life that does not require me to abandon myself. And from there, you begin again, not as the person who was broken, as the person who became aware, as the person who learned, as the person who now knows that love should not require self-erasure, as the person who understands that compassion needs boundaries, as the person who knows that leaving can be an act of courage, As the person who finally understands that the greatest sign was never that someone else was being removed from your life. The greatest sign was that you were finally ready to stop removing yourself from your own. So if today you feel something changing, honor it. If you are exhausted, listen. If you are seeing patterns, pay attention. If you are questioning the cycle, do not silence yourself. If you are becoming less interested in explaining, ask yourself why. If you are beginning to want peace more than reconciliation, do not shame yourself. If you are discovering boundaries, practice them. If you are healing, be patient. And if you are finally choosing yourself, keep going. Because sometimes the ending of a relationship is not the ending of your story. Sometimes it is the moment the story finally becomes yours. You are not here to spend the rest of your life convincing someone to love you properly. You are here to live, to grow, to connect, to create, to love without abandoning yourself, to give without disappearing, to forgive without reopening every door, to trust without ignoring patterns, to become compassionate without becoming available for exploitation, to become strong without becoming hard, and to build a life where peace is no longer something you hope someone else will give you. It becomes something you protect. That is your next chapter. And perhaps the universe has already been sending the signs. Not that you are being punished, not that someone else is going to suffer, but that you are waking up, you are seeing, you are feeling, you are remembering, you are returning. And this time, you are returning to yourself.